The sound of Jerusalem that morning was unlike any other morning in the city's long memory. It was not the usual cacophony of bleating lambs being driven through narrow streets toward the temple, though those sounds were everywhere. It was not the rhythmic hammering of merchants setting up their stalls in the lower market, though that too filled the air. It was something deeper, something that resonated in the chest before it reached the ears. A sound that seemed to come from the stones themselves, as if the city were exhaling after holding its breath for generations. The year is 33 Anno Domini. The feast is Passover. And what you are about to experience is not merely a historical reconstruction. It is the acoustic fingerprint of the most charged week in human history, captured in the voices, footsteps, prayers and silences of a city that had no idea it was standing at the hinge point of eternity. To understand what Jerusalem sounded like during that Passover, you need to understand first what Jerusalem was. This was not the quiet, contemplative city of postcards and pilgrim dreams. This was a city transformed, swollen to bursting with humanity. Normally home to approximately 80,000 souls, during Passover week, Jerusalem became something else entirely. Scholars estimate that the population exploded to somewhere between 200,000 and 300,000 people, perhaps more. Imagine that. In the span of a few days, a city more than tripling in size. Every available room rented, every courtyard filled with makeshift tents, every rooftop converted into sleeping space. The city did not just grow, it transformed into a living organism of compressed humanity, and that compression had a sound. The first thing a visitor would hear, approaching Jerusalem from any direction during Passover week, was the sound of feet. Not the footsteps of dozens or hundreds, but of thousands, tens of thousands, an endless river of sandals and bare feet striking packed earth, limestone paths, ancient roads worn smooth by centuries of pilgrims. The rhythm was not uniform. It could not be. There were families with small children, their steps irregular and punctuated by questions asked in high, clear voices. There were elderly pilgrims, their pace slower, more deliberate, often accompanied by the tap of walking sticks on stone. There were groups of young men, walking quickly, energetically, their conversations animated and loud. And underneath it all, like a bass line that never stopped, was the shuffle and scrape of tired feet, blistered feet, feet that had walked for days or weeks to reach this moment. But feet were just the foundation. Rising above that endless percussion was the sound of languages. Jerusalem during Passover was not a monolingual city. It was a Babel of tongues. You would hear Aramaic, the common language of Judea and Galilee, spoken in a dozen different regional accents. The Aramaic of a Galilean sounded different from the Aramaic of a Judean, softer in some consonants, harder in others. You would hear Hebrew, especially near the temple, the sacred language reserved for prayer and scripture. It sounds ancient and formal. You would hear Greek, the lingua franca of the Eastern Roman Empire, spoken by diaspora Jews who had traveled from Alexandria, from Ephesus, from Corinth, from Rome itself. Their Greek carried the flavors of their home cities. You would hear Latin, though less commonly, the sharp, efficient syllables of Roman soldiers and administrators. And woven through all of this, like threads in an impossibly complex tapestry, were other languages. Parthian, Arabic, Egyptian Coptic, languages from the edges of the known world, all converging on this single city for this single week. The semantic content of these voices varied wildly, but certain phrases repeated like liturgical refrains. Where is the upper city? Do you know a place to stay? How much for the lamb? Is there room? Where can we find water? Have you seen my brother? The questions of displaced people trying to navigate an overcrowded city, trying to fulfill religious obligations in the midst of chaos. Now layer onto this human soundscape the animals. Passover was not just about people, it was about sacrifice, and sacrifice required animals. Lambs, primarily. The law required that every family sacrifice a lamb, and if you do the mathematics, if there were 200,000 people in Jerusalem, and each lamb served a family of roughly 10 to 15 people, you are talking about somewhere between 13,000 and 20,000 lambs in the city during that week. 13 to 20,000 lambs, each one bleating. The sound of sheep is not gentle when multiplied by thousands. It becomes a constant, undulating blanket of noise, rising and falling but never disappearing. The bleating mixed with the sharper sounds of goats also brought for sacrifice and for milk. You would hear the low, resonant sounds of cattle brought by wealthier families for more elaborate offerings. You would hear the cooing and fluttering of doves and pigeons, sold in the court of the Gentiles for those who could not afford larger animals. The sound of wings, thousands of wings, in cages and crates stacked in the temple precincts. And then there were the donkeys. Donkeys were the trucks of the ancient world, and during Passover they were everywhere, carrying supplies, carrying the elderly, carrying goods for sale. The braying of donkeys is one of the most distinctive sounds in the natural world, harsh and grating and impossible to ignore. During Passover week in Jerusalem, that sound was as common as birdsong in a forest. Let us move now into the city itself. Let us walk through the gates. The most common entry point for pilgrims coming from the north was through the Damascus Gate area, though in 33 AD it would not have been called that yet. Pilgrims from Galilee, and Jesus and his disciples were Galileans, would have approached from this direction. As you passed through the gate, the sound changed. Outside, on the open roads, sound dissipated into the hills and sky. Inside, sound became concentrated. The streets of Jerusalem were narrow, some no more than 2 or 3 meters wide. Stone walls rose on either side. Sound did not escape, it bounced, echoed, amplified. A conversation spoken at normal volume 50 meters away could reach you as a murmur. A shout could sound like it was right beside you when it originated 2 streets over. The acoustics of the ancient city were not like modern cities with sound-absorbing materials and wide boulevards. Stone and more stone, creating an echo chamber. As pilgrims moved through these streets toward their destinations, they would hear the sounds of commerce. Jerusalem, during Passover, was an economic event as much as a religious one. Merchants knew this was their most profitable week of the year. You would hear the calls of vendors. Fresh bread here, oil, wine, figs, dates, salted fish, the best lamb. Come and see. Every vendor competing for attention, voices rising to be heard over other voices, creating a chaotic symphony of commercial desperation and opportunity. You would hear the clinking of coins, the most universal sound of human transaction. Pilgrims needed to exchange their foreign currency for the Tyrian shekels required for the temple tax. The money changers set up tables, and the sound of silver coins being counted, tested, exchanged was constant. The metallic percussion of commerce. You would hear haggling. In Middle Eastern markets, then as now, the stated price was never the final price. Every transaction was a negotiation, and negotiations have their own acoustic signature. The initial offer, stated with confidence. The counteroffer, delivered with theatrical shock. The back and forth, voices rising, hands gesturing, sometimes laughter, sometimes mock anger, until finally agreement was reached. Multiply that single negotiation by thousands happening simultaneously, and you have one layer of the city's soundscape. Now let us approach the temple. The temple was not just the religious center of Jerusalem, it was the acoustic center. Everything in Jewish life oriented toward the temple, and during Passover, that orientation became absolute. The temple complex was massive. The platform on which it sat covered approximately 37 acres. To put that in perspective, that is roughly the size of 25 modern city blocks. This was not a building, it was a city within a city, and it was loud. The dominant sound of the temple during Passover was the sound of sacrifice, slaughter on an industrial scale. Jewish sources tell us that on the afternoon of the 14th of Nisan, the day before Passover officially began, the sacrificing of the Passover lambs took place in the temple. The people were divided into 3 groups. Each group entered the court of the priests in turn. The gates were closed behind them. Then the slaughter began. Each man would slaughter his own lamb. The priests stood in rows with bowls, catching the blood. One priest would catch the blood and pass the bowl to the next, receiving an empty bowl in return, creating a kind of assembly line that terminated at the altar where the blood was dashed against the base. Meanwhile, other priests were hanging the carcasses, flaying them, removing the prescribed portions to be burned. What did this sound like? First, the bleating of the lambs intensified as they sensed what was coming. Animals know. Then the sounds of slaughter, the cutting, the blood pouring into bowls, the thud of carcasses, the scraping of knives on skin and sinew, the crackle and roar of the altar fire, constantly fed with fat and organs. The fire itself was enormous. Josephus, the first-century Jewish historian, describes the altar as being 15 cubits high, that is roughly 7 meters, and the fire burned continuously, fed by wood and sacrifice. A fire that size does not whisper, it roars. The sound was constant, deep, powerful enough to be felt in the chest. And throughout all of this, the Levitical choir sang. The Levites were the tribe assigned to temple service, and part of their responsibility was music. During the sacrifice of the Passover lambs, they sang the Hallel, Psalms 113 through 118. These were not quiet, contemplative songs. They were sung loudly, triumphantly, by a choir of trained voices accompanied by instruments. The sources mention cymbals, harps, lyres, and trumpets. The silver trumpets of the priests were particularly significant. These were long, straight trumpets, and their sound was brilliant and piercing, designed to cut through every other noise. They signaled the beginning of sacred actions, the transitions between sections of the service. That sound, bright and metallic and authoritative, punctuated the entire sacrificial process. Imagine standing in the court of the Gentiles, the outermost court where anyone could enter during this time. You are surrounded by thousands of people, pilgrims pressing close, trying to see, trying to hear. Vendors still selling doves and changing money even here. And from the inner courts, beyond where you can see unless you are Jewish and male, comes this overwhelming wave of sound. Bleating, slaughter, fire, singing, trumpets. All of it echoing off the massive stone walls of the complex, off the porticos with their rows of columns, creating a reverberant, overwhelming acoustic environment. Ancient sources describe the noise as so loud that you could not hear the person next to you speak. They described the crowd as so dense that when people bowed in worship, they were pressed together, yet miraculously, they said, when they prostrated themselves fully, there was always room. Whether literal or liturgical exaggeration, it communicates the sensory overload of the space. Outside the temple, but still within the city, there were other constant sounds. The sound of water. Jerusalem's water supply was always a concern, and during Passover it became critical. The city relied on cisterns, on the pool of Siloam fed by the Gihon spring through Hezekiah's tunnel, on aqueducts bringing water from distant sources. You would hear water being drawn, poured, carried, the splash of washing. Ritual purity was essential, especially during Passover, and that required immersion in a mikveh, a ritual bath. Many mikvaot have been excavated around Jerusalem, particularly near the Temple Mount. You would hear the sound of people entering water, immersing, emerging. The specific acoustic quality of voices in a small stone chamber, the way sound becomes intimate and resonant. You would hear the sound of construction and repair. Jerusalem was always building, always maintaining. Herod the Great had begun his massive expansion of the temple complex decades earlier, and work continued. You would hear the striking of chisels on stone, the creaking of wooden cranes and scaffolding, the calls of work crews coordinating heavy lifts. The city was not a museum, it was a living, working place. As evening approached, the soundscape shifted. The sacrifice was complete. Families returned to wherever they were staying, carrying their roasted lamb. Passover itself began at sundown. Jewish days start at sunset, not sunrise. And as darkness fell, you would hear the city transition. The commercial sounds faded. The temple quieted, though the altar fire never went out. What emerged was the sound of thousands of simultaneous Passover meals. The Passover Seder, the ritual meal, has a structure, a script. It involves specific prayers, specific songs, specific readings from Scripture. All of this was done aloud. Now imagine that happening not in one place, but in thousands of places simultaneously. From every house, every courtyard, every rented room, every roof came the sound of the Passover liturgy. The 4 questions asked by the youngest child, the recounting of the Exodus story, the blessings over bread and wine, the singing of the Hallel Psalms again, this time in family groups rather than in the temple choir. The effect was extraordinary. Individual voices blended into a collective murmur that rose from the entire city like incense. You could not make out individual words, but you could hear the rhythm, the cadence, the rise and fall of communal prayer and song. It was as if the city itself were praying. In a sense it was. This was not background noise. This was the foreground, the main event, the reason everyone had come. And it continued for hours. The Passover meal was not rushed. It was a time of remembering, of teaching children, of celebrating freedom. As the night deepened, the sound gradually softened. Families finished their meals. Children fell asleep. Conversations became quieter, more intimate. But the city never became silent. Too many people, too little space. There was always movement, always sound. Guard patrols walking the walls and streets. Roman soldiers stationed throughout the city. Extra forces brought in to maintain order during the volatile feast week. Their footsteps were different, heavier, the sound of military sandals with hobnails striking stone. The occasional clank of armor or weapon. You would hear dogs. Jerusalem had street dogs, scavengers. During Passover, with so much food, so much waste, their presence increased, barking, snarling over scraps. The city's sanitation was primitive by modern standards, and the sheer volume of animal slaughter meant blood running in channels toward the Kidron Valley, offal disposed of outside the walls. This attracted dogs and birds, the harsh calls of crows and ravens, and underneath everything always was the sound of footsteps, people walking to fetch water, walking to check on family members lodged elsewhere in the city, walking because there was no room to sleep, and walking was better than trying to rest in an impossibly cramped space. Walking because they were too excited, too moved by the significance of the moment. Now we need to talk about a specific sound that occurred during this week, a sound that was not routine, that marked this Passover as different from all others. The sound of a crowd shouting in unison. Palm Sunday, the Sunday before Passover, when Jesus entered Jerusalem riding on a donkey. The Gospels describe the scene, crowds lining the road, spreading their cloaks on the ground, cutting branches from trees and waving them, and shouting, "Hosanna to the Son of David! Blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord! Hosanna in the highest!" A crowd shouting together creates one of the most powerful sounds humans can produce. It is not just the volume, though that is significant. It is the unity. When hundreds or thousands of voices shout the same words at the same time, individual voices disappear into a collective roar that is greater than the sum of its parts. It is a sound that stirs emotion in those who hear it, even if they do not understand the words. It is a sound that carries, that travels far beyond the immediate location. Roman authorities watching from the Fortress Antonia would have heard it. Pilate in his residence would have heard it. People throughout the city would have heard it and wondered what was happening. The sound of political danger, the sound of messianic expectation, the sound of hope and threat intertwined. Then, just days later, another crowd sound. But this one was different. The Gospels tell us that on Friday morning, a crowd gathered before Pilate's judgment seat, demanding crucifixion. "Crucify him! Crucify him!" The same mechanism, a crowd shouting in unison, but the content transformed from Hosanna to crucify. This is one of the most chilling acoustic shifts in all of history. The same city, many perhaps of the same people. But the sound now was not celebration, it was bloodlust. The acoustics were the same, the human machinery was the same, but the moral content had inverted completely. Let us pause here to understand what crucifixion sounded like, because this too is part of the acoustic landscape of that week. Crucifixion was a public punishment, designed to be seen and heard. It was a deterrent through horror. The Via Dolorosa, the path Jesus walked carrying his cross, was not a quiet, contemplative walk. It was a public procession through crowded streets, Roman soldiers, criminals being executed, crowds watching, some mourning, some mocking, some simply curious. The Gospels mention that women were weeping. The sound of grief is distinct, wailing, keening. In Middle Eastern culture, both ancient and modern, mourning is vocal and expressive. These sounds would have mixed with the jeers of those who mocked. If you are the Son of God, save yourself. He saved others, let him save himself. Mockery has its own acoustic quality, cruel laughter, exaggerated words, the pleasure humans take in the suffering of those they have decided deserve it. The crucifixion itself, the act of nailing a human being to wood, produced sounds we do not like to imagine but which were real. The pounding of hammer on nails, the cries of the victim. Crucifixion was designed to prolong suffering, and that suffering was vocal. The difficulty of breathing while hanging created a specific kind of gasping, labored breath. The Gospels record 7 statements Jesus made from the cross. Each one would have required enormous effort, forcing air through a body in respiratory distress. My God, why have you forsaken me?" That cry, shouted loudly, according to the text, was heard by those standing at a distance. In the afternoon air, perhaps as the wind shifted, it carried. And then there were the attendant sounds of crucifixion. Soldiers gambling for clothes, their casual conversation and laughter while men died above them. The sound of dice or lots being cast. The crowd gradually dispersing as the hours passed, footsteps fading, until only a small group remained. The sound of those few. Mary, the mother of Jesus, John, Mary Magdalene. Their weeping was quieter now, more personal, the sound of intimate grief rather than public mourning. At the moment of death, Matthew's Gospel records that the veil of the temple was torn in two from top to bottom. The earth shook, rocks split. We do not know what the tearing of the temple veil sounded like, or if anyone heard it in the moment, but the rending of heavy fabric, if that is what it was, would produce a specific sound, a ripping, a tearing, and an earthquake, even a localized one, creates a sound unlike any other, a deep rumbling, felt as much as heard, the sound of stone grinding against stone, the clatter of objects falling, shouts of alarm. Earthquakes terrify people in a primal way, because the ground itself, the one thing we assume is stable, betrays that assumption. The centurion who was there, according to the Gospel, said, "Truly, this was the Son of God." Whatever he experienced, it was enough to produce that declaration. And the acoustic elements, the earthquake, the darkness, the manner of Jesus' death, were part of what moved him. As evening approached on Friday, the pace quickened. Jewish law required that bodies not remain on crosses during the Sabbath, especially not during a Passover Sabbath. The sound of legs being broken to hasten death, a sickening crack of bone. The sound of a spear piercing flesh. The removal of bodies, the carrying of Jesus' body to a nearby tomb. The rolling of a large stone across the entrance, a deep grinding sound, stone on stone, heavy and final. Then the sealing, the placing of a Roman seal, and guards posted. Their voices in the gathering darkness, orders given, positions taken. The Sabbath that followed was the quietest day of the week in Jerusalem under normal circumstances, and this was a high Sabbath, a Passover Sabbath. Work ceased, travel ceased beyond a minimal distance. Cooking ceased, food having been prepared beforehand. Commerce ceased. The temple services continued, but even they were reduced. What you would hear on that Saturday was the sound of a city holding its breath. Prayers in homes and synagogues, the murmur of scripture reading, quiet conversations, footsteps going to and from appointed places of prayer. But compared to the previous days, the city was hushed. This was by design. The Sabbath was meant to be a day of rest, a cessation from the noise and labor of ordinary life. But this Sabbath was anything but ordinary. Under the quiet, there was tension. The followers of Jesus were in hiding, afraid, grieving. The religious authorities were vigilant, worried about the claims Jesus had made about rising from the dead. The Romans were watchful, ensuring that order was maintained. So the quiet was not peaceful. It was the quiet of waiting, of uncertainty. Then, Sunday morning, before dawn, the soundscape shifted again. The first sounds would have been the sounds of women walking through dark streets, carrying spices to anoint a body. Their footsteps, their whispered conversation. Then, according to the Gospel accounts, an earthquake again. The sound of the stone rolling away, not by human effort, but by angelic intervention, though what that sounded like we can only imagine. The cries of the guards, fear, the sound of running feet as they fled. Then the women's voices, confused, afraid, amazed. The sound of Mary Magdalene running back to tell the disciples. Breathless words. They have taken the Lord out of the tomb. Peter and John running, their footsteps urgent. The sound of ragged breathing, men sprinting through early morning streets. The sound of them entering the tomb. Silence as they saw the linen cloths lying there, the face cloth folded separately. Then their footsteps leaving, slower now, uncertain what to think. Mary Magdalene remained. Her weeping is recorded. Then a voice. "Woman, why are you weeping?" The sound of Jesus' voice. We do not know what his voice sounded like physically, but we know its effect. Mary. One word, her name, spoken by the risen Christ. Her response. Rabboni, teacher. The sound of recognition, the sound of impossible joy. Over the next hours and days, more voices. The disciples behind locked doors. Suddenly Jesus among them. Peace be with you. The sound of their fear giving way to joy. Thomas's skeptical voice. Unless I see. Then, a week later, his declaration. My Lord and my God. Each of these moments had a sound, a specific acoustic event, words spoken in real rooms to real people, creating ripples that spread and eventually became the church, became Christianity, became the faith that shaped Western civilization and spread across the world. But we are getting ahead of ourselves. Let us return to that Passover week itself, to the layered, complex soundscape of Jerusalem in 33 AD. There is one more category of sound we must consider: silence. Not the absence of sound, because in Jerusalem that week there was never true silence, but intentional silence, moments when sound was suppressed or withheld. Jesus, before his accusers, the text tells us, remained silent. Then the governor asked him, "Are you the king of the Jews?" Pilate marveled at his silence. Silence in the face of accusation, in the face of mockery, in the face of threat. That silence was itself a sound, or rather, a noticeable absence that those present remarked upon. There is the silence of the disciples after Jesus' arrest, fleeing, hiding, saying nothing when perhaps they should have spoken. There is the silence of the crowd after Jesus died. The Gospel says that the crowds who had gathered to watch beat their breasts and went away. The carnival atmosphere of a public execution giving way to something else, a recognition that something had gone wrong, or perhaps terribly right, but in either case, silence was the only appropriate response. And there is the silence of God, or what felt like silence to those living through it. When Jesus cried out, my God, why have you forsaken me?" He was quoting Psalm 22, a psalm that begins in abandonment and ends in vindication. But in that moment, what he and those who heard him experienced was the silence of heaven. No audible answer, no intervention, just the sound of a man suffering and the sky growing dark. The ancient world was much louder in some ways than ours. No engines, no amplified music, no sirens. But also, human and animal sounds were more dominant. People lived closer together. Walls were thinner. Privacy as we understand it did not exist. Sound traveled freely. Information spread by voice, by messenger, by rumor. If something significant happened, people heard about it through human chains of communication, each person telling the next. During Passover in Jerusalem, with so many people so densely packed, news traveled with astonishing speed. Jesus is entering the city. Jesus has been arrested. Jesus is before Pilate. Jesus is condemned. Each piece of news rippling outward through the crowd, voices carrying it, modifying it, amplifying it. Let us also consider the sound of prayer. Jewish prayer in the first century was largely communal and largely oral. The Shema, the central declaration of Jewish faith, was recited twice daily. Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. During Passover week, with hundreds of thousands of Jews in Jerusalem, that prayer rose thousands and thousands of times each day. The 18 benedictions, the Amidah, prayed while standing, facing toward the temple. The grace after meals, required after eating bread. All of these created a constant, pervasive layer of prayer sound throughout the city. Not loud, not demanding attention, but always there, like the spiritual respiration of a community. And we should consider music beyond the temple. While the temple had the official, trained Levitical choir, music was not confined there. Psalms were sung in homes, in synagogues, during travel. Jewish culture was and is a singing culture. The Psalms were the songbook of Israel. Instruments, while more limited in ordinary homes than in the temple, were still present. Simple flutes, small harps, percussion. During celebrations, during the Passover meal itself, there was singing. The Hallel Psalms again, but also other songs. Songs of ascent, sung by pilgrims as they traveled up to Jerusalem. The joy of approaching the holy city expressed in melody and rhythm. Children's voices deserve their own mention. Passover is particularly focused on transmission to the next generation. The Seder is built around children asking questions. Why is this night different from all other nights? The sound of children's voices, high and clear, asking these ancient questions, receiving these ancient answers. Children playing in courtyards and streets, because children play, even during solemn festivals. Their laughter, their shouts, their games. The sound of a city filled with families, not just adult pilgrims but whole communities spanning generations. There is also the sound of illness and disability. The Gospels frequently mention blind beggars, lame beggars, calling out for alms or for healing. Jerusalem during Passover would have drawn beggars from a wide region, knowing that this was when people's hearts were most open, when religious obligations encouraged charity. The calls for mercy, for help, the specific vocal quality of desperation. These sounds were part of the urban fabric, perhaps so common that residents tuned them out, but present nonetheless. Animals beyond those destined for sacrifice also filled the city. Donkeys and camels for transport, dogs, as mentioned earlier, cats, certainly, though they are less documented. Birds. Jerusalem in spring would have migratory birds passing through. The songs of birds in the early morning, indifferent to human drama, singing because that is what birds do. The crows and ravens scavenging, the cooing of doves, both those wild and those caged for sale. Weather creates sound. Spring in Jerusalem can be unpredictable. Wind rising from the desert or off the Mediterranean. The sound of wind moving through narrow streets creates specific acoustic effects, whistling around corners, rattling awnings and shutters. If rain came, which was less likely in late spring but possible, the sound of rain on stone, on roofs, on the pavement of the temple courts. Thunder, perhaps, distant or near, rolling across the hills. The Gospels mention darkness covering the land from noon until 3 on the day of crucifixion. Darkness that profound, if caused by an eclipse or by storm clouds, would have come with sound. Changes in atmospheric pressure affect how sound travels. The eerie quiet before a storm, then the rush of wind and crack of thunder. Fire was essential for cooking, for light, for warmth in the cool evenings. The crackle of thousands of cooking fires throughout the city. The smell of smoke, yes, but also the sound of it, the rush of flames, the pop and hiss of burning wood. Torches carried at night, especially on Thursday night, when Judas led the temple guards to Gethsemane. The Gospels mention torches and lanterns. A group of men walking through the night, carrying fire, creates light, but also sound. The crackling of pitch-soaked torches. The footsteps of armed men. The clank of swords and clubs. In the Garden of Gethsemane, before the arrest, there was the sound of Jesus praying, "My Father, if it is possible, let this cup pass from me. Nevertheless, not as I will, but as you will." The sound of a man in agony, though not physical agony yet, spiritual agony. The text says his sweat became like drops of blood, the sound of labored breathing, the sound of returning to sleeping disciples. "Could you not watch with me 1 hour?" Disappointment in his voice, sadness. Then the approach of the crowd, the sound that woke the disciples. Voices, lights, the crowd appearing through the olive trees. Judas approaching. "Rabbi," a kiss. The sound of betrayal is a kiss. Then chaos, a sword drawn, a blow, the ear of the high priest's servant cut off. His cry of pain, Jesus' rebuke. "Put your sword back. Do you think I cannot appeal to my Father?" The sound of authority, even in the moment of arrest. Then the disciples fleeing, running footsteps disappearing into the darkness. The trials, there were multiple, happened at night and early morning. These were not public events with crowds. These were smaller, more contained acoustically. But the sounds were still significant. The questions of the high priest. "Are you the Christ, the Son of the Blessed?" Jesus' answer, "I am, and you will see the Son of Man seated at the right hand of power and coming with the clouds of heaven." The high priest tearing his robes, a dramatic gesture that would have produced a ripping sound. "Blasphemy! What further witnesses do we need?" Then the abuse. Some began to spit on him. The sound of spitting, the blows, the mockery. "Prophesy! Who is it that struck you?" The sound of fists on flesh. The sound of humiliation. Peter in the courtyard below. The servant girl's voice. "You also were with the Nazarene, Jesus." Peter's denial. "I neither know nor understand what you are talking about." Another voice. "This man is one of them." Another denial. Peter's voice rising, more insistent. Then a third time. "Certainly you are one of them, for you are a Galilean." His accent gave him away. Sound marking identity. Peter began to invoke a curse on himself and to swear, "I do not know this man of whom you speak." And immediately, the rooster crowed. The sound of a rooster is one of the most recognizable sounds in the world, harsh and piercing, impossible to ignore. In that moment for Peter, it was the sound of his own failure, the sound of Jesus' prediction coming true, the sound that broke him. The text says he broke down and wept. The sound of a grown man weeping, shoulders shaking, breath coming in gasps. The marketplace sounds continued throughout the week, indifferent to the drama unfolding. Life went on. People still needed to buy food, to sell goods, to conduct business. The routine sounds of ordinary life persisted, even as extraordinary events unfolded. This is one of the strange features of history. World-changing moments happen in the midst of people buying bread, children playing, merchants haggling. Most people in Jerusalem that week had no idea what they were witnessing. They heard the sounds, saw some of the events, but did not grasp the significance. To them it was just another Passover, perhaps more crowded than usual, perhaps with some extra excitement about an itinerant preacher from Galilee, but essentially ordinary. Only in retrospect did the sounds become meaningful. The disciples, after the resurrection, remembered what Jesus had said, remembered the events of that week, and suddenly the sounds took on new meaning. The hosannas, the Last Supper conversation, the prayer in Gethsemane, the trial, the crucifixion, the silence of Saturday, the voices on Sunday morning. All of it became part of a story, the narrative that they would spend the rest of their lives proclaiming. The book of Acts describes what happened next. 50 days after Passover came Pentecost, another pilgrimage feast, though smaller. The disciples were gathered in Jerusalem. Suddenly there was a sound like a mighty rushing wind filling the house where they were sitting. A sound. The arrival of the Holy Spirit was acoustic before it was anything else. A sound from heaven. Then tongues of fire, then the disciples speaking in other languages, and the crowd gathering because they heard this sound and were bewildered, because each one was hearing them speak in his own language. The acoustic miracle. People from every nation hearing the gospel in their own tongue. The curse of Babel reversed. And Peter standing up, raising his voice, preaching. His voice that had denied now.